My son-in-law and his senator father threw my pregnant daughter off the deck of their yacht into the pitch-black Atlantic Ocean just past midnight. She was 25 years old, and she was carrying the first grandchild I would never get to hold. As I screamed into the roaring wind, watching her white dress disappear into the churning black water like a ghost, they didn't panic. They didn't call for help. They laughed. They said she was being histrionic. Then, they ordered the captain to turn the massive vessel around and headed back to the warmth of the Hamptons, leaving her there to die in the cold. When the Coast Guard finally pulled her from the drift 3 hours later, blue-lipped and barely clinging to life, I didn't waste my breath yelling at the police who were already shaking hands with the senator. I knew screaming wouldn't save her, and the law wouldn't touch them. So, I wiped the blood from my lip, waited until I could find a secure line, and made the only phone call that mattered. A call to a ghost in the Adirondack Mountains. I said only 4 words to my brother. Time to dismantle them. Before I break down exactly how a retired ironworker and a forensic accountant brought a billion-dollar dynasty to its knees, make sure to subscribe to Silent Revenge and like this video. They tried to bury the truth, just like they tried to bury my daughter. But they forgot one thing: rust never sleeps, just like they tried to bury my daughter. Let me know in the comments, when the law fails you, is revenge justified? But every disaster starts with a warning sign that gets ignored. The evening had started with the deceptive calm of a sea before a hurricane. Sophie and I were guests aboard the Vanduyn family's mega-yacht, the Sovereign, for their annual Labor Day gala anchored off Montauk. The air had that heavy, humid thickness of late summer, the kind that sticks to your skin and warns of storms. I'm Elias Thorne, 66 years old, a retired ironworker who spent 40 years walking steel beams 800 feet in the air, building the very skyscrapers where men like the Vanduns trade stocks and ruin lives. I'm a man of rivets and welds, not cocktails and whispers. I raised Sophie alone after her mother passed, teaching her that character is like steel, it's forged in fire and it holds the weight of the world without bending. I taught her to be strong. I taught her to be good. I didn't teach her that some people are just rust painted over with gold. Sophie had married Preston Vanduyn 3 years ago, dazzled by the charm that men of his station were like a tailored suit, a veneer of sophistication that hid the structural rot underneath. I had reservations from the start, call it the instinct of a man who knows that shiny metal isn't always strong metal, but seeing her happy, seeing her glow when he walked into a room, I swallowed my doubts and stood in the back of the church, holding my tongue, because a father's job is to support the foundation, not crack it. Tonight, however, the air on the deck of the Sovereign felt charged with a different kind of electricity, a static tension that made the hair on my arms stand up like I was standing on a ridge during a lightning storm. The guests, a collection of hedge fund managers, lobbyists, and Hampton socialites, mingled with the casual indifference of people who have never had to worry about the price of milk, sipping champagne that cost more than my monthly pension. I stood by the rail, gripping a tumbler of scotch I hadn't touched, watching Sophie across the teak expanse. She looked beautiful in her white dress, but her smile was brittle, a thin crack in a porcelain facade, and she kept touching her stomach with a protective, nervous flutter of her hand. She had told me the news quietly before we boarded, that I was going to be a grandfather, and the joy I felt was the only thing keeping me on this floating monument to excess. She was waiting for the right moment to tell Preston and the senator, hoping for a public celebration of the next generation, but as I watched them huddled in the corner, their heads bent together in hushed, serious conversation, I saw Preston glance at her not with love, but with the cold, calculating look of an accountant finding a critical error in a ledger. The clock struck midnight, signaling the end of summer, and while most of the party moved to the lower deck for the toast, Sophie approached them near the stern, her face alight with a fragile hope that I prayed wouldn't be shattered. I couldn't hear the words at first, the wind whipping them away, but I saw the shift in the atmosphere instantly, a drop in pressure that precedes a collapse. She placed Preston's hand on her belly, whispering the secret that should have been a blessing, and Preston pulled his hand back as if he had been burned by a welding torch, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He turned immediately to his father, the senator, who didn't look surprised. He looked furious, his politician's mask slipping to reveal the predator underneath. They cornered her against the railing, their body language aggressive and sharp, blocking her path back to the safety of the crowd. I started moving then, my heavy boots thudding against the deck, pushing past a waiter, my heart hammering a warning rhythm against my ribs. "It's not a trap." I heard Sophie cry out, her voice rising above the wind. "We're a family." "You're a liability," Preston sneered, his voice carrying the sharp edge of cruelty. "You think you can lock me down with a brat? You think I'm stupid?" The senator stepped forward, placing a hand on Preston's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to steady him. "Handle it, son," Alistair said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Before it becomes a headline." And then, with a synchronized movement that spoke of a lifetime of shared sins, they shoved her. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't an accident. It was a forceful, two-handed push designed to clear the safety rail. Sophie went over backward, her scream swallowed instantly by the dark, churning wake of the engines. I roared, a sound torn from the bottom of my lungs, and lunged for Preston, ready to snap his neck like dry pine, but two private security contractors, ex-military types hired to keep the rabble in line, intersected me, tackling me to the hard deck with the efficiency of a demolition crew. I struggled, throwing an elbow into a ribcage, feeling something crack, but they pinned me, pressing my face into the teak while I watched Preston lean over the rail, looking down into the abyss where my daughter had vanished. He turned back to his father, laughing a breathless, incredulous sound. "Did you see her face?" he asked, wiping a splash of champagne from his tuxedo jacket. "So dramatic. She's probably swimming for the buoy right now just to make a scene." Senator Vanduyn adjusted his cufflinks, looking down at me with the disdain one reserves for a stain on the carpet. "Captain," he called out calmly into his radio. "We have a guest who has become unmanageable. And my daughter-in-law has decided to take a midnight swim. Let's return to the marina. She can cool off and meet us there." The massive engines roared, the deck vibrated against my cheek, and the Sovereign began its slow, majestic turn away from the spot where my daughter was drowning in 50-degree water, leaving her alone in the dark while the jazz music played on. The wake of the Sovereign was a wide, churning scar of white foam cutting through the black ocean, a visible track of abandonment that widened with every revolution of the massive screws as the yacht thundered back toward the mainland. I lay on the deck where the security team had left me, gasping for air, my ribs throbbing in a rhythm that matched the engine's vibration, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, expanding terror in my chest. I scrambled to my knees, fumbling for my phone with hands that felt like numb blocks of wood, my fingers slipping on the screen as I dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, her voice tinny and distant against the roar of the wind, I didn't waste time with explanations. I screamed the coordinates I had memorized from the GPS display near the helm, shouting the latitude and longitude over and over again like a prayer. I told her a woman was overboard, that she was pregnant, and that the vessel was leaving the scene, but even as the words left my mouth, I saw Senator Vanduyn standing by the sliding glass doors of the main salon, watching me with a look of detached pity, as if I were a drunk shouting at a lamppost rather than a father pleading for his daughter's life. He took a sip of his scotch, checked his watch, and then turned his back on the dark horizon, disappearing into the warmth of the cabin to prepare the lies that would greet us on shore. The 40-minute transit back to the Montauk Yacht Club was a blur of helpless rage, a purgatory where I was forced to sit under the watchful eyes of the hired muscle while the distance between me and my drowning child grew with every nautical mile. I calculated the drift, the temperature of the water, and the failing buoyancy of a heavy evening gown, the math of survival turning into a countdown in my head. When the yacht finally docked, the scene that awaited us wasn't a crime scene investigation, but a carefully choreographed public relations maneuver. The flashing lights of the East Hampton police cruisers reflected off the polished hull, but the officers weren't rushing up the gangplank with weapons drawn. They were standing at ease, waiting to receive the senator. I watched as Alistair Vanduyn descended first, his face a mask of patrician concern, shaking the hand of Chief Miller, a man I knew the senator had endorsed in the last election with the familiarity of an old friend. I was hauled off the boat moments later, not as a victim or a witness, but as a suspect, my arms wrenched behind my back and secured with zip ties that bit into my wrists. "He's distraught, Chief," I heard Preston say, his voice trembling with a performance of grief that made my stomach turn. "He's been drinking heavily all night. He attacked my father when she slipped. We tried to stop her, but she was just so unstable. I didn't fight them then. I knew enough about structural integrity to know when the load was too heavy to lift. I let them shove me into the back of a cruiser, the hard plastic seat cold against my spine, and watched through the wire mesh as the narrative solidified around the Vanduns like quick-drying concrete. They stood in a circle of light, surrounded by supportive officers and a few early reporters, spinning a tale of a troubled, hysterical woman and her violent, alcoholic father, while the Coast Guard searchlights swept the harbor in a futile, blinding arc. I sat in that cage for 3 hours, listening to the static of the police radio, a lifeline to the dark water where Sophie was fighting for every breath. I thought about the iron I used to work, how it stays rigid until the heat becomes too much, and then it bends, twists, and fails. I wondered if Sophie was bending out there in the dark. I wondered if she had already broken. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to since her mother died, begging him to keep her head above the swells, to let her be stronger than the steel I had raised her to be. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dispatcher coordinating the grid search, each negative contact hitting me like a hammer blow to the chest. It was nearly 3:30 in the morning when the radio finally erupted with a voice that was urgent, breathless, and decidedly unscripted. "Sector 4, we have a visual on a target. South of the buoy. Looks like a person. No movement." The air in the cruiser seemed to vanish. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cage, straining to hear the follow-up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity, a void where hope and despair wrestled for control, until the voice crackled back, tight with adrenaline. "We have her. Female, unresponsive. Severe hypothermia. Pulse is thready but present. We are initiating medevac protocols now. Get an ambulance to the marina, stat." The relief that washed over me was so violent it felt like a physical collapse, my head dropping to my knees as I sobbed, dry, heaving sounds that I couldn't suppress. She was alive. Broken, freezing, and abandoned by the men who swore to protect her, but she was alive. The cruiser door opened, and a young officer looked in, his expression unreadable. "They found her," he said, not unkindly. "She's critical. They're taking her to Southampton Hospital. We're taking you to the station for processing." I looked up at him, my eyes burning. "Processing for what?" I rasped. "Assault and battery," he replied, closing the door. As the car pulled away, leaving the marina behind, I didn't look back at the yacht or the senator. I looked at the road ahead, visualizing the map of the hospital, the layout of the police station, and the structural weaknesses of the men who had done this. They had made a fatal error in their calculations. They had left a witness alive. The sterile fluorescent glare of the Southampton hospital waiting room felt less like a place of healing and more like a holding cell for the damned, the air humming with the low, electric buzz of vending machines and the hushed whispers of people praying for miracles that weren't coming. I had arrived still wearing the tuxedo shirt from the gala, now stained with salt water and the blood from my split lip, looking every inch the unhinged brawler the police report claimed I was. I marched toward the intensive care unit with the singular, blind momentum of a man walking across a high beam in a gale, prepared to tear the doors off their hinges to see my daughter, but I was stopped not by medical staff or security, but by a phalanx of 3 men in charcoal suits who stood before the ICU entrance like a human retaining wall. They were the Vanduyns' lawyers, high-priced fixers with eyes like sharks and voices like velvet, and the lead attorney, a man whose smile didn't reach his eyes, stepped forward with a condescending calmness that made my hands twitch with the memory of swinging a sledgehammer. He informed me, in a tone one might use to explain physics to a toddler, that Mr. Preston Vanduyn had invoked his rights as the primary next of kin, and given the sensitive nature of the incident and my documented aggression earlier that evening, I was legally barred from the patient's room until further notice. I stood there, physically dwarfing the man, realizing with a sick, sinking feeling that the ink on the restraining order was drying faster than the water in my daughter's lungs, and that in the eyes of the law, the husband who tried to kill her had more rights to her broken body than the father who would die to save it. I retreated to a plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room, not because I was obeying them, but because if I stayed standing in front of those doors, I would have committed a felony that would have removed me from the chessboard entirely, and I needed to be free to burn their world down. An hour bled into 2, a torture of watching the lawyers whisper into their phones, orchestrating the cover-up with the efficiency of a corporate merger, until a doctor finally emerged, looking exhausted and grim, bypassing the suits to walk straight to me. She introduced herself as Dr. Evans, her eyes scanning my battered face with a flicker of sympathy that told me she knew the official story was a lie, but she was bound by the chart in her hands. She told me Sophie was stable but critical, kept in a medically induced coma to allow her brain to swell without damage, her body fighting a severe case of hypothermia and aspiration pneumonia from the seawater she had inhaled. Then, she paused, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the heartbreak underneath, and delivered the news that shattered whatever remained of my soul, the trauma of the fall, the shock of the freezing water, and the lack of oxygen had been too much for the pregnancy. The heartbeat had stopped before they even got her onto the gurney. I sat there, the plastic chair digging into my back, and felt a cold, hollow wind blow through me, carrying away the future I had imagined, the wooden toys I would carve, the fishing trips, the sound of Grandpa Elias, leaving only a vast, silent crater where a life should have been. The Vanduys hadn't just tried to kill my daughter, they had successfully murdered my grandchild, extinguishing a spark of innocent life because it threatened the liquidity of a trust fund, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me until I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't feel anything but a pure, distilled hatred that crystallized into a weapon. Across the room, the wall-mounted television droned on, tuned to a 24-hour news cycle that fed on tragedy like a parasite, and suddenly, the Chiron flashed red with breaking news, Hampton's socialite tragedy. I watched, unable to look away, as the screen filled with a glamorous file photo of Sophie and Preston at their wedding, an image I remembered taking, where her smile was genuine and his was a practiced grimace, while the anchor read a statement that had been released by the office of Senator Alastair Vanduyn mere minutes ago. The statement was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a carefully constructed narrative that absolved the family while burying the victim under a landslide of feigned concern and character assassination. It spoke of the family's deep devastation over the accidental fall involving their beloved but deeply troubled daughter-in-law, referencing a history of emotional instability and erratic behavior exacerbated by alcohol, implying without directly stating that Sophie had either jumped or drunkenly stumbled to her doom. They were painting my sweet, gentle girl as a hysterical, suicidal drunk who had ruined their gala, effectively putting her on trial while she lay comatose in the next room. The anchor pivoted to a clip of Senator Vanduyn, looking grave and statesmanlike outside the police station, asking for privacy and prayers during this difficult time, his voice catching with a performative grief that made my stomach turn. They were winning the war before I had even realized it had started, using their media connections to shape reality, turning the victim into the villain and the monsters into saints, and I sat there in my blood-stained shirt, an ironworker with dirt under his fingernails, realizing that the truth didn't matter in the Hamptons, only the narrative mattered, and they owned the printing press. The final nail in the coffin of my faith in the system came when I watched the lead detective on the case, a man I had given my statement to hours ago, walk into the waiting room and shake hands with the Vanduyns' lawyer. It wasn't a formal handshake, it was the comfortable, familiar grip of two men who play golf at the same club, who attend the same fundraisers, who understand that some people are citizens and others are merely obstacles. They spoke in hushed tones, the detective nodding as the lawyer gestured toward a folder of documents, likely the fabricated evidence of Sophie's instability, and not once did the detective look in my direction. Not once did he approach the father of the victim to ask a follow-up question or offer an update. I was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of their clean, expensive world, irrelevant because I couldn't donate to the police benevolent fund or offer a seat on a board of directors. The realization hit me with the force of a pile driver. I could scream the truth until my throat bled. I could point to the bruises on my daughter's arms. I could recite the coordinates of the drop, but it wouldn't matter because the machinery of justice in this town was lubricated with Vanduyn money. If I played by their rules, if I waited for the investigation to run its course, Preston would be quietly acquitted, Sophie would be institutionalized or silenced, and Alistair Vanduyn would continue his climb to whatever political summit he was eyeing. I stood up, the joints of my knees popping, and turned my back on the lawyers, the police, and the lies on the television, walking toward the payphone in the hallway because I knew my cell was likely dead or tapped, reaching into my pocket for the only currency that mattered now, a quarter and the memory of a phone number I hadn't dialed in 10 years. The payphone at the far end of the corridor was a relic, a battered chrome artifact from an era before everyone carried their lives in their pockets, bolted to the wall like a shrine to obsolescence that nobody noticed anymore, which made it the only secure line in the building. I fumbled for a quarter, my hands shaking not from fear but from the residual adrenaline of a night spent in hell, and pressed the cold receiver against my ear, the dial tone humming a steady, indifferent note that felt like the only constant in a world that had spun off its axis. I punched in the number from memory, a sequence of digits I hadn't used in a decade but that was burned into my brain alongside my social security number and the date of my wife's death, listening to the ring stretch out across 300 miles of fiber optic cable to a cabin deep in the Adirondacks. It rang 4 times, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for me to wonder if he was even alive, if he had changed his number, if he would hang up the moment he heard my voice after the way we had left things at our mother's funeral. But then the line clicked open and a voice as dry and rough as sandpaper rasped, "Yeah, who's this?" "It's Elias," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, rough with salt and smoke and grief, stripped of the polite cadence I used to navigate the world of architects and permits. "Don't hang up, Silas. I need you." There was a pause on the other end, a silence so thick I could hear the faint background noise of wind howling through pine trees and the clinking of ice in a glass, the sounds of a life chosen for its isolation. "Elias," he said finally, the hardness in his tone softening just a fraction, replaced by a wary curiosity that felt dangerous. "I haven't heard that name in 10 years. You calling to tell me you finally bought that truck, or did someone die?" I leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the coin box, closing my eyes against the harsh glare of the hospital lights, and let the dam break, the words tumbling out in a rush that I couldn't control. They tried to kill her, Silas. They threw Sophie off a boat. She's in a coma. The baby is gone. And they're laughing, Silas. They're telling the cops she was drunk. They're telling the news she's crazy. And the cops are shaking their hands. I told him everything, my voice dropping to a whisper as a nurse walked by, recounting the gala, the argument on the deck, the way Preston had looked at his father before the push, the laughter that had followed the splash, and the sickening turn of the yacht away from the drowning girl. I told him about the lawyers who blocked the ICU doors, the press release that blamed the victim, and the way the detective had looked through me like I was glass, painting a picture of a conspiracy so tight and so moneyed that I was suffocating inside it. Silas listened without interrupting, his silence shifting from indifferent to attentive to predatory, the kind of listening he used to do when he was breaking down a mob boss's ledger for the FBI, hunting for the one inconsistent number that would bring the whole house of cards down. When I finished, breathless and shaking, there was a long silence on the line, the kind that usually precedes a judgment, and I braced myself for him to tell me I was crazy, to tell me to hire a lawyer, to tell me he was too old for this garbage. The Vanduys, Silas said finally, his voice low and devoid of any emotion, stating the name like he was reading a label on a specimen jar. Senator Alistair Vanduyn. Senate Finance Committee. Old money. The kind of money that buys judges for Christmas and senators for Easter. I gripped the phone tighter. Yeah. That's them. I can't fight them, Silas. I'm just a guy who walks beams. They have the press, the cops, the lawyers. I'm drowning here. I heard the sound of a lighter flicking on, the inhale of smoke, and then the slow exhale, a ritual I remembered from when we were kids hiding behind the garage. You're thinking about it like a street fight, Elias, he said, the name sounding less like a label and more like a lifeline. You want to go over there and break his jaw. But you can't punch a ghost, and you can't punch a bank account. Men like Vanduyn don't live in the physical world, they live in paper. They live in reputation. They live in leverage. I don't care about leverage, I hissed, the rage flaring up again. I want them to pay. I want them to hurt like she's hurting. Silas chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound that sent a shiver down my spine because I knew exactly what that laugh meant. It meant he had found the loose thread. Pain is relative, brother. For you, pain is a broken bone. For Alistair Vanduyn, pain is exposure. It's losing the one thing his money can't buy back. You called the right guy, Elias. You didn't call a lawyer. You called a cleaner. I heard movement on the other end, the sound of a chair scraping back, keys jingling, the distinct thump of a heavy duffel bag being pulled from a closet. I'm coming down the mountain, he said, his voice hardening into the tone of a man who is already working. Meet me at the motel on the Montauk Highway, the one with the flickering neon sign that nobody looks at. Don't talk to the cops again. Don't sign anything. And for the love of God, Elias, stop looking like a victim. If they think you're broken, they'll get sloppy. Be the grieving, confused father. Let them think they've already won. I'll see you in 6 hours. The line went dead, leaving me standing in the hallway with the dial tone buzzing in my ear, but for the first time in 12 hours, I didn't feel helpless. I felt the cold, hard comfort of knowing that the cavalry was coming, and he was bringing a shovel. The air in the motel room had grown thick and stagnant over the last 48 hours, a haze of cigarette smoke and the ozone smell of overheating electronics that Silas seemed to thrive in, while I sat by the window watching the rain streak the glass, feeling the ghost of my daughter's laughter haunting the silence. I had done exactly what my brother asked, playing the role of the broken, submissive father to perfection, I had called the East Hampton police to apologize for my outburst, my voice trembling with a rehearsed frailty that made the desk sergeant uncomfortable, and I had even sent a lily arrangement to the Vanduyn estate with a card expressing my confusion and grief, a gesture that tasted like bile in my throat but seemingly bought us the time we needed. Silas had been hunched over his laptop for 2 days straight, his eyes scanning endless PDFs of court filings, probate records, and leaked financial disclosures he'd pulled from the dark corners of the internet where forensic accountants trade secrets like currency. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me since Tuesday, treating the investigation with the silent intensity of a monk, until the sudden, sharp clack of his laptop lid closing snapped the tension in the room like a dry twig. He swiveled in his chair, pouring 2 more fingers of the Johnny Walker into our dirty plastic cups, and the look on his face wasn't triumph, but the grim satisfaction of a pathologist who has finally isolated the cause of death in a cadaver that everyone else thought died of natural causes. "I found the gun, Elias," Silas said, his voice low and raspy, sliding a stack of printed papers across the scarred laminate table toward me. "It's not a .38 and it's not a knife. It's a 60-page document filed in the Cayman Islands in 2012 called the Vanduyn Dynasty Preservation Trust. I stared at the dense legal jargon, the words blurring into a meaningless gray wall, shaking my head because I didn't understand how ink on a page could push a girl into the Atlantic Ocean. Silas leaned forward, tapping a highlighted section on page 12 with a manicured fingernail. "You have to understand how men like Alistair Vanduyn think. They don't care about people, they care about continuity. This trust holds the bulk of the family fortune, roughly $600 million in securities and real estate, but it's locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Preston doesn't own any of it. He's an allowance kid, getting a monthly stipend that barely covers his polo club dues, and he's been drowning in debt for years. I found gambling markers in Atlantic City, leveraging on margin accounts that went bust, and a quiet little habit of borrowing from loan sharks in Providence. The kid is broke, Elias, and he's been waiting for his 35th birthday next month to access the principal, but there are 2 very specific, very nasty clauses standing in his way." Silas flipped the page to a section header titled Beneficiary Conduct and Lineage Protocols, reading aloud with a cynical sneer that made the legal terms sound like a death sentence. Clause 4A, the Morality and Stability Clause. If the primary beneficiary, that's Preston, is involved in a divorce proceeding, legal separation, or public scandal involving moral turpitude prior to the vesting date, the trust principal remains locked for another 10 years, and his stipend is cut in half to protect the assets from division. He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. That's the first trap. Preston couldn't divorce Sophie. If he left her, or if she left him because she found out about his debts or his other woman, he loses the money. He was trapped in that marriage by his own greed. But that's not the killer, Elias. This is. He pointed to the next paragraph, the one that made my blood run cold. Clause 7B, the Dynasty Protection Clause. In the event of the birth of a legitimate heir prior to the vesting date, the trust principal is automatically resecuritized for the benefit of the next generation. The funds are placed into a conservatorship until the child turns 18 to ensure the Vanduyn legacy continues intact. If Sophie had that baby, Preston would have been bypassed entirely. He wouldn't see a dime of that $600 million until he was 53 years old. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me as I slumped back against the headboard, the horror of it settling into my bones. Sophie wasn't killed in a fit of rage. She wasn't killed because they hated her, or because she was annoying, or even because she was trapping him. She was killed because she was a biological lock on a bank vault. Her pregnancy, the thing she was so terrified and excited to tell him about, was the trigger that turned the $600 million inheritance into a 20-year waiting period. He needed the money now, I whispered, the room spinning slightly. He needed to pay off the debts. Silas nodded, his face grim. Exactly. He couldn't divorce her because of Clause 4A. He couldn't let her have the baby because of Clause 7B. So, what's the only option left for a sociopath who needs $500 million? Silas slid the final paper across the table, a life insurance policy taken out on Sophie Vanduyn 6 months ago, with a double indemnity rider for accidental death. If she dies in a tragic accident, there is no divorce. There is no heir to trigger the dynasty clause. The trust sees a widower with no children, and on his 35th birthday, the vault opens wide. Plus, he collects a cool $5 million tax-free from the insurance to tide him over. They didn't just kill your daughter, Elias. They liquidated her. I stood up and walked to the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink until the porcelain threatened to crack under my hands, staring at the face in the mirror that looked old and gray and haunted. I had spent my life building things, houses, foundations, families, operating on the belief that if you did good work and loved your children, the world would be fair. But the Vanduys operated in a different universe, a cold, mathematical void where a human life was just a variable in a spreadsheet that needed to be deleted to balance the equation. They had looked at my pregnant daughter, shivering in the cold sea air, and they hadn't seen a wife or a mother. They had seen an obstacle to liquidity. I splashed cold water on my face, watching the droplets run down the drain like tears, and when I looked up again, the grief was gone, replaced by a cold, industrial resolve. They did it for money, I said to Silas as I walked back into the room, my voice steady for the first time in days. Just money. Silas closed the folder, a dark satisfaction in his eyes. It's always money, Elias. And that's how we're going to hang them. Because now we know what they're protecting, and we know exactly where to plant the dynamite. The investigation shifted gears in the cramped, smoke-filled motel room, moving from the cold calculus of trust funds and insurance policies to the visceral, bloody history of the men who thought they owned the world, as Silas turned his attention away from Preston's incompetence and focused his predatory gaze on the patriarch, Senator Alistair Vanduyn. While I paced the length of the room, my boots wearing a track into the cheap carpet, Silas spent 16 hours scouring the digital archives of small-town police blotters and defunct local newspapers, looking for the kind of buried anomaly that usually signals a paid-for silence. He found it in a scanned microfiche from a Colorado Gazette dated February 1995, a 3-paragraph blurb buried on page 6 about a tragic skiing accident involving a 22-year-old political aide named Elena who had been working for a prominent, unnamed East Coast family at their vacation lodge in Aspen. The article was sparse, clinical, and reeked of a press release, citing unfamiliarity with the terrain and a high-speed collision with a tree as the cause of death, but Silas, with the instinct of a bloodhound smelling rot beneath the snow, noticed that the case was closed within 24 hours of the body being found, a timeline that was impossibly fast for a fatality involving a federal employee unless someone very powerful had greased the wheels of the entire county legal system. Silas dug deeper, bypassing the public records which had been scrubbed clean and tapping into his network of old law enforcement contacts who hoarded favors like currency, eventually securing a grainy PDF of the original incident report that listed the employer not as unnamed, but as Alistair Vanduyn, then a rising star in the state Senate with eyes on Washington. The narrative in the report was too perfect, too polished, describing a late-night solo ski run that went wrong, but the supplemental notes from the responding deputies told a different, darker story, noting that the body was found in an area of the mountain that was technically closed and that the snow around her had been disturbed in a way that suggested a struggle, not a singular impact. Silas sat back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the deep lines of his face, and told me that men like Vanduyn don't just wake up one day and decide to throw a pregnant woman off a yacht. Violence is a habit, a tool they keep in their back pocket, and once they use it successfully to solve a problem, they never hesitate to use it again. He pointed to the name of the lead investigator on the case, a Detective Miller, no relation to the Hamptons chief, and noted that Miller had resigned abruptly 2 months after the incident, moving to a remote cabin in Montana, far away from the jurisdiction he had sworn to serve. We waited until the sun was up in Montana before Silas made the call, using a burner phone and a voice that shed its rough, mountain edge to adopt the authoritative, menacing cadence of a federal investigator, a role he had played for real for 30 years and could slip back into like a second skin. He didn't ask Miller if he remembered the case. He told him that the case was being reopened due to new evidence in a federal homicide investigation involving the Vanduyn family, and that Miller could either be a cooperating witness or a co-conspirator facing obstruction charges. I watched Silas work, marveling at how he manipulated the silence on the other end of the line, letting the old man's fear marinate in the quiet pauses, until finally, the voice on the speakerphone cracked, frail and terrified, admitting that he had been waiting for this call for nearly 30 years. Miller told us that the body of the girl, Elena, hadn't looked like a ski accident victim at all. She had defensive fractures on her forearms, bruising on her neck consistent with strangulation, and the blunt force trauma to her skull hadn't come from a tree, but from a heavy, manufactured object, likely a ski pole swung with malicious intent. All of which he had been forced to omit from the final report after receiving a visit from 2 men in suits and a direct order from the sheriff. The revelation hung in the air of the motel room like toxic smoke, transforming Alastair Vanduyn from a corrupt politician protecting his son into a serial predator who had been killing women to protect his convenience for decades. Miller admitted that the girl hadn't just been an employee, she had been threatening to go to the press about an affair, about promises made and broken, and Alastair had solved the problem the only way he knew how, by erasing it. I leaned against the wall, feeling a fresh wave of nausea but also a hardening of my resolve, realizing that my daughter wasn't just a victim of a bad marriage, but collateral damage in a dynasty built on bones. Silas ended the call with a promise of immunity if Miller testified, then looked at me with eyes that were cold and hard as flint. "We have the pattern," he said, saving the audio recording of the call to 3 different encrypted drives. "We have the financial motive for the son, and we have the history of violence for the father. We aren't just going to get them for attempted murder, Elias, we're going to bury them under 30 years of their own filth." The transition from excavating the ancient, calcified sins of the father to uncovering the fresh, bleeding wounds inflicted by the son required a shift in Silas's forensic methodology, moving from dusty microfiche to the digital breadcrumbs of modern banking where nothing is ever truly deleted, only obscured. Silas spent the better part of Wednesday tracing a convoluted series of wire transfers that originated from a Vanduyn-controlled shell company in Delaware, passed through a legal consulting firm in the Cayman Islands, and eventually landed, surprisingly intact, in a modest savings account in Astoria, Queens, 5 years ago. The recipient was a woman named Chloe Miller, no relation to the detective, just another common name in a world of victims who had been a 22-year-old intern at Preston's hedge fund for exactly 3 months before abruptly resigning and signing a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive it practically forbade her from speaking her own name. Silas handed me a dossier that contained little more than a driver's license photo of a girl with bright eyes and a hopeful smile, alongside a current address for a small independent bookstore where she now worked, far removed from the Shark Tank of high finance. He told me that while he could find the money, he couldn't extract the story because money is cold, but trauma is hot, and Chloe wouldn't talk to a forensic accountant looking for a ledger error. She needed to talk to a father who understood exactly what it felt like to be crushed by the Vanduyn machine. I drove west toward the city through a relentless, gray drizzle that turned the lie into a slick river of red brake lights, parking my truck blocks away to avoid drawing attention to the quiet sanctuary Chloe had built for herself in a neighborhood of brick row houses. The bookstore was warm and smelled of old paper and vanilla, a stark, grounding contrast to the sterile, cold violence of the yacht, and I found her shelving paperbacks in the poetry section, looking older and more guarded than the girl in the photo Silas had found. When I approached, her instinct was immediate and visceral. She stiffened, clutching a book to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting to the door as if she expected a team of lawyers to burst in and drag her away for violating the silence she had sold 5 years ago. I didn't introduce myself as Elias Thorne, the ironworker who had assaulted a senator. I introduced myself simply as Sophie's father, and I saw the recognition flash in her eyes, followed instantly by a wave of terrified guilt because she had seen the news, she had seen the lies, and she knew exactly who I was and, more importantly, who my son-in-law was. I didn't raise my voice or step into her personal space. I simply stood there, a large, broken man in a flannel shirt, and asked her for 5 minutes of her time, not to threaten her, but to tell her that she wasn't the only one Preston Vanduyn had tried to destroy. We sat at a small table in the back of the shop, surrounded by stacks of unsold hardcovers, and I watched her hands tremble as she traced the wood grain of the table, terrified that even having this conversation was a breach of contract that would ruin her life. I didn't ask her for details of what happened that night 5 years ago because I didn't need to know the specifics to understand the dynamic. Men like Preston Vanduyn take what they want and pay for the cleanup later, treating human dignity like a commodity to be traded on the futures market. Instead, I pulled a photograph from my pocket, not the wedding photo the news was using, but a picture I had taken of Sophie in the ICU just yesterday, intubated and bruised, her face swollen and pale, a portrait of violence that no amount of PR spin could sanitize. I slid it across the table and told her that my daughter was pregnant, that she had been thrown into the Atlantic like garbage because her pregnancy threatened Preston's trust fund, and that the only reason Preston was free to do this to Sophie was because his money had bought Chloe's silence 5 years ago. I wasn't blaming her, I said softly, because I knew the power of the Vanduyn name and the weight of their checkbook, but I needed her to understand that the NDA she signed wasn't just a contract, it was a permission slip for him to keep hunting. Chloe looked at the photo for a long time, tears gathering in her eyes and spilling over to track through the light dusting of makeup she wore, her breathing hitching as the reality of her own history collided with the brutality of my daughter's present. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she had been paid $500,000 to forget that Preston Vanduyn had locked her in an office during a holiday party and assaulted her, that she had been told by a team of smiling lawyers that if she ever spoke a word of it, they would bankrupt her family and ensure she never worked in finance again. She had taken the money because she was 22 and scared and powerless, thinking that she was saving herself, but looking at Sophie's broken face, she realized she had only been renting her safety at the cost of someone else's future. I told her that we didn't need her to go to the police, who were already in the senator's pocket. We needed her to speak to a journalist Silas knew, a reporter at the New York Times who wasn't afraid of old money, and we needed her to do it anonymously but with enough detail to shatter the veneer of respectability Preston hid behind. She looked at me, then at the photo, and finally nodded, a small, decisive movement that signaled the end of her silence and the beginning of Preston Vanduyn's nightmare. She wrote down a phone number on a slip of paper and pushed it across the table, telling me to have the reporter call her tonight, because she was tired of being afraid, and she was done letting the Vanduys buy their way out of hell. Sunday morning in the Montauk Motel broke with the same gray indifference as the days before, but inside room 12, the atmosphere was charged with the static electricity of a controlled demolition waiting for the plunger to be pushed, centered entirely around the thick stack of newsprint Silas had retrieved from the lobby at dawn. He tossed the Sunday edition of the New York Times onto the unmade bed, the heavy thud of the paper sounding like a gavel strike, and there, below the fold but dominating the bottom half of the front page, was the headline that Silas had orchestrated with the precision of a conductor. The Vanduyn curse, a pattern of tragedy haunts a political dynasty. It wasn't an accusation of murder. Journalists at the Gray Lady are too careful about libel laws for that, but it was something far more dangerous to a man like Senator Alistair Vanduyn. It was a question mark placed next to his reputation. I picked up the paper, my rough hands smoothing out the newsprint, and read the opening lines which juxtaposed the tragic accident of my daughter with the mysterious death of a 22-year-old aide in Aspen 30 years ago, drawing a line of blood between the two events that no amount of PR spin could erase. The article, written by an investigative journalist known for tearing down Wall Street titans, didn't just regurgitate the police reports. It highlighted the inconsistencies, the swift cremation of the Aspen victim, the suppressed coroner's doubts that Silas had unearthed, and, most damning of all, an anonymous quote from a former financial intern, who detailed a culture of silence and payoffs that protected the Vanduyn men from the consequences of their appetites. The impact of the story was immediate and visceral, a shockwave that rippled out from the newsstands of Manhattan and crashed into the gated community of East Hampton, shattering the carefully constructed dome of privacy the Vanduys had lived under for decades. By noon, the television in a corner of the motel room was broadcasting live footage of news vans swarming the limestone pillars of the Vanduyn estate, the same driveway where I had been turned away by security now choked with cameras and reporters hungry for a comment on the Aspen connection. Silas sat in the armchair, watching the chaos unfold with a cold, predatory smile, sipping his coffee as if he were watching a favorite movie, noting that the phone lines at the Vanduyn residence would be melting down right now, their lawyers scrambling to issue cease and desist orders that were useless against a story already in print. The narrative had shifted. Yesterday, the story was about a drunken, unstable girl who fell off a yacht, but today, the story was about a powerful family with a habit of dead women turning up in their wake. The Times had done exactly what Silas promised. It hadn't tried to convict them in a court of law. It had indicted them in a court of public opinion, stripping away the benefit of the doubt that old money relies on like oxygen. At 2 o'clock, the breaking news chirrun flashed red again, announcing a live press conference from Senator Alastair Vanduyn, and the screen cut to a podium set up hastily at the end of their driveway, the iron gates looming behind him like prison bars. Alastair walked out not with the confident, easy stride of the statesman I had seen on the yacht, but with the stiff, brittle posture of a man walking to the gallows, his face pale and slick with a sheen of sweat that the makeup couldn't hide. He gripped the sides of the podium until his knuckles were white, staring into the bank of microphones with eyes that darted nervously, looking for a friendly face and finding none. He began to speak, his voice booming with a feigned indignation that sounded tinny and desperate, railing against political hit jobs and baseless conspiracy theories dredged up by enemies who wanted to tarnish his service to the country. He called the article a vicious fabrication and invoked the memory of his beloved daughter-in-law, claiming that dragging up a tragic skiing accident from a quarter-century ago was a grotesque insult to her memory. But the more he spoke, the more he looked like a man trying to hold back the tide with a spoon, the structural integrity of his persona failing under the weight of the truth. I watched the screen, mesmerized by the crack in the facade, seeing for the first time the fear living behind the senator's eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with polling numbers and everything to do with prison cells. He was answering questions he hadn't been asked, denying connections that hadn't been made explicitly, flailing against the invisible net Silas had woven around him. When a reporter from CNN shouted a question about the non-disclosure agreements mentioned in the article, Alastair flinched as if he'd been slapped, his eyes narrowing in a flash of genuine, unbridled rage before his lawyer stepped in and cut the conference short, hustling him back toward the safety of the estate. The image of his retreat, hasty, uncoordinated, and terrified, was the signal we had been waiting for. The monster wasn't invincible, he was just a man with a lot to lose, and he had just realized that his money couldn't buy silence anymore. Silas turned off the TV, the sudden silence in the room heavy with implication, and looked at me with the satisfaction of a man who has just watched the main support beam shear. "He's rattled," Silas said simply, lighting a cigarette. "He's making mistakes. He's reacting instead of controlling. And now that the blood is in the water, The sharks are going to start circling." He was right. The phone on the dresser, the dedicated burner line we had included in the anonymous tips to the Times, began to ring a tentative, shrill sound that signaled the next phase of the demolition had begun. The burner phone on the scarred motel dresser rang with a jarring, mechanical trill that cut through the silence of the room like a high-tension cable snapping under load, a sound so alien after days of quiet surveillance that both Silas and I froze, staring at the cheap plastic device as if it were a live grenade. Silas was the first to move, snapping the phone open and pressing it to his ear with the practiced caution of a man who spent 30 years listening to wiretaps, his face remaining impassive as he listened to the voice on the other end, though I saw his eyes narrow slightly, the predatory focus sharpening behind his wire-rimmed glasses like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. He didn't speak for a long time, only offering monosyllabic prompts to keep the caller talking, until finally he wrote an address on the back of a napkin, hung up, and looked at me with a grim intensity that told me the demolition was about to enter its final phase, the point where we stopped looking for cracks and started placing the charges. He told me that the caller was a kid named Leo, a steward who had been scrubbing the teak on the lower deck of the Sovereign the night Sophie went over, a kid who had been fired the next morning, paid $5,000 in cash, and told that if he ever mentioned the name Vanduyn again, he would be buried under a mountain of legal trouble that would destroy his immigrant parents. Leo had seen the Times article, seen the history of dead women trailing behind Alistair Vanduyn like exhaust fumes, and the fear of being the next loose end tied off in a shallow grave had finally outweighed the fear of the threats, driving him to make the call that would hang them. We met him 2 hours later in the rain-slicked parking lot of a 24-hour diner off Route 27 in Amagansett, a location chosen for its distance from the manicured lawns of East Hampton and the prying eyes of the Vanduyn security detail. Leo was sitting in a rusted Honda Civic, the engine idling to keep the heater running against the damp chill, looking every bit the terrified 20-year-old he was, his eyes darting between me and Silas as we climbed into his back seat, soaking wet and smelling of the cheap motel and stale tobacco. He was shaking, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, and when he looked at me in the rearview mirror, I saw a mixture of guilt and terror that broke my heart because I knew he was just another piece of collateral damage, a rivet that had popped under the immense pressure of the Vanduyn machine. He told us, his voice cracking with the strain of holding back tears, that he had been on the aft deck having a smoke break when he heard the shouting, that he had stayed hidden in the shadows because the crew was strictly forbidden from being seen by the guests during the gala, and that he had watched the entire scene unfold with a clarity that haunted his nightmares. He confirmed everything I had told the police, but they refused to hear, that Sophie hadn't slipped, she hadn't stumbled, and she certainly hadn't been drunk. She had been cornered, terrified, and pleading for her life while Preston and his father advanced on her like wolves circling a wounded deer. Leo took a shuddering breath, the condensation on the windows closing us into a gray, private world, and delivered the detail that made Silas's jaw tighten with the satisfaction of a hunter springing a trap. He told us that after the splash, after the scream was cut short by the freezing water, there was a moment of absolute silence followed by the sound of laughter. It wasn't the nervous laughter of shock, he insisted, but the cruel, dismissive laughter of men who had just taken out the trash, with Preston joking that she was finally cooling off and Alistair remarking that the problem was resolved before ordering the captain to turn the boat around. Leo had frozen, terrified that if he moved, he would be next over the rail, and he had stayed hidden until the security team started clearing the deck, witnessing the calculated delay before they raised the alarm, the way they stood by the rail and watched the black water swallow her for agonizing minutes before pretending to notice she was gone. He had been fired the moment the boat docked, hustled off with an envelope of cash and a threat that involved immigration enforcement and his mother's address, a threat that had kept him silent until he read the newspaper and realized that men who kill aides in Aspen and get away with it wouldn't hesitate to silence a deckhand who knew where the bodies were buried. But Leo had brought more than just his memory to the meeting. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cracked smartphone, his thumb hovering over the screen as he explained that he had access to the yacht's internal security server from his tablet in the crew quarters. He told us that while the Vanduys had wiped the main system the moment they docked, erasing the footage from the hard drives, they didn't know that the system performed an automatic cloud backup every hour, a backup that Leo had downloaded onto his phone before his access was revoked. He handed the phone to me, and I stared at the small, glowing screen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a sledgehammer as I pressed play and watched the grainy, night vision footage of my daughter's last moments of consciousness. The angle was from a lower deck camera pointing upward, capturing the audio perfectly even if the visual was obscured by the railing, a damning digital record of the motive that the Vanduys had tried to bury under layers of money and lies. I heard Preston's voice, slurring slightly with rage and scotch, screaming that she was a trap and a leech, shouting that he wouldn't let her bastard lock up his money for 18 years, explicitly referencing the trust fund clause Silas had uncovered in the Cayman documents. I heard Alistair's voice, cold and authoritative, telling her that accidents happen at sea all the time and that she should think very carefully about her next step, a premeditated threat captured seconds before the violence. Watching the video felt like dying, like drowning alongside her, seeing the shadow of her small frame backing away from them, hearing the fear in her voice as she tried to de-escalate a murder, but Silas watched it with the cold calculation of a prosecutor who has just been handed a smoking gun. He took the phone from my trembling hands, ejected the SIM card to ensure no remote wipe could touch it, and looked at Leo with a grim nod, telling the kid that he had just bought his freedom and that the Vanduys were finished. This wasn't just hearsay anymore, and it wasn't just the word of a grieving, unstable father against a decorated senator. It was objective, digital proof of conspiracy, motive, and intent to kill, recorded in their own voices and preserved in the cloud they didn't understand. Silas promised Leo protection, promised to put him in a hotel where the Vanduys' private investigators couldn't find him, and as we stepped back out into the rain, the weight of the phone in Silas's pocket felt heavier than lead, a digital bullet that was finally ready to be fired into the heart of the Vanduyn legacy. The Vanduyn Autumn Charity Gala was designed as a fortress of high society rehabilitation, a black-tie bulwark constructed to repel the waves of scandal that had been crashing against the family name for the past week. And as I sat in the unmarked surveillance van parked just beyond the estate's limestone gates, watching the procession of limousines deliver the titans of New York industry to the very driveway where Alistair Vanduyn had denied his crimes, I marveled at the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of men who believe a champagne toast can wash away blood. The ballroom inside was a glittering cage of crystal chandeliers and forced smiles, where Preston Vanduyn stood beside his father, playing the role of the grieving yet resilient husband, accepting condolences for his wife's accident, while simultaneously soliciting donations for a maritime safety charity, a grotesque irony that made Silas let out a low, disgusted growl from the passenger seat. We weren't alone in the van. Sitting behind us were two special agents from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and a liaison from the Southern District of New York, men and women who had watched Leo's video in stunned silence 3 hours ago and immediately signed the warrants that would end the Vanduyn dynasty. This wasn't a local Hamptons raid, susceptible to the senator's phone calls or the chief's golf buddies. This was a federal intervention, a surgical strike coordinated to happen in the most public, humiliating way possible, because Silas had convinced the U.S. attorney that the only way to neutralize a man like Alistair Vanduyn was to strip him of his power in front of the very people who gave it to him. The signal came at 9 o'clock sharp, just as the senator took the stage to deliver his keynote address about resilience and family values, his voice booming over the speakers that we monitored via a wiretap on one of the catering staff Silas had flipped. We exited the van and joined the phalanx of 20 federal agents marching up the gravel drive, the sound of their boots striking the pavement in unison acting as a drumbeat of approaching judgment that cut through the humid night air. The private security detail at the front door, the same men who had roughed me up on the yacht, took one look at the tactical gear and the grim determination of the FBI and wisely stepped aside, opening the double mahogany doors to reveal the opulent scene within. We entered the ballroom like a wave of dark water, the sudden intrusion of armed officers into the sea of silk gowns and tuxedos causing a ripple of confusion that silenced the string quartet and turned 300 heads toward the entrance. Alistair Vanduyn froze mid-sentence, his hand gripping the podium, his eyes widening as he saw not just the federal agents, but me standing behind them, the retired ironworker he had dismissed as a nuisance, now standing as the architect of his ruin. Silas, moving with the focused intensity of a man closing the final ledger, tapped a command into his tablet, overriding the ballroom's audiovisual system just as the lead agent began to speak. The senator's booming voice was suddenly cut off, replaced by a hiss of static and then the crystal-clear audio from the yacht, amplified to a deafening volume that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. "You think you can lock me down with a brat?" Preston's drunken, rage-filled voice echoed through the room, followed by the senator's cold, calculating command, "Handle it, son. Before it becomes a headline." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room, but the audio didn't stop there. It played the splash, the silence, and then the laughter, that chilling, dismissive laughter that had haunted my nightmares for weeks. Alistair stood frozen on stage, stripped naked by his own words, looking like a man whose skeleton had suddenly dissolved, while Preston dropped his champagne glass, the crash of crystal on marble punctuating the damning recording. The lead agent, a hard-faced woman named Agent Miller who had no patience for political theater, marched straight to the stage, her voice cutting through the stunned silence as she announced that the party was over. She didn't offer the courtesy of a private conversation. She unclipped the handcuffs from her belt and ascended the stairs, informing Senator Alistair Vanduyn that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and the 1995 homicide of Elena Ross. The senator tried to stammer a protest, his eyes darting to his donors for support that wasn't there, but Miller leaned into the microphone he was still holding and added, "We have the cloud backups, Senator. And we have the trust fund documents." The color drained from Alistair's face so completely he looked like a wax figure melting under the stage lights, his mouth opening and closing in a silent fish-like protest as he was spun around and cuffed, the metallic click echoing through the sound system for all of New York to hear. Simultaneously, two agents descended on Preston Vanduyn near the bar, where he had been trying to blend into a group of investors, looking for an exit that didn't exist. He tried to run, a pathetic, stumbling lunge toward the kitchen doors that was cut short when an agent tackled him to the marble floor, pinning him beneath the weight of the law he thought he was above. Preston screamed as they hauled him up, shouting about his rights, about his father, about the incompetence of the police, but his protests were drowned out by the hundreds of smartphones that had risen from the crowd like a digital firing squad, live streaming his arrest to the world. He looked at me as they dragged him past, his eyes wild and terrified, and I didn't say a word. I just watched him, letting him see the face of the man who had turned his own greed into a noose. They were paraded out of the ballroom, father and son, stripped of their dignity and their delusion, leaving behind a room full of former allies who were already deleting their contact information, the illusion of their invincibility shattered by the undeniable reality of steel bracelets and the quiet, relentless persistence of the truth. The salt air in the quiet coastal town of Greenport, a working-class harbor far removed from the manicured cruelty of the Hamptons, carried the scent of yeast and cinnamon this morning, drifting from the open windows of the small bakery Sophie had bought with the settlement money we wrung from the Vanduyn estate. I sat on the wrap-around porch of the Victorian fixer-upper we shared, watching the late afternoon sun glint off the water of the Picnic Bay, a body of water that was calm and sheltering, unlike the violent, churning Atlantic that had almost taken my daughter from me 2 years ago. Sophie was inside, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough with a rhythmic, meditative force, her movements efficient and strong, lacking the tentative, fearful quality that had defined her during her marriage to Preston. Every time I looked at her, I saw the faint white scar running along her hairline where she had struck the water, a permanent reminder of the night she fell, but I also saw the steel that had formed beneath her skin in the aftermath. We didn't talk about the Vanduys much anymore. Their names had become like curse words in a house of worship, spoken only when necessary and always with a shudder, but their absence was a tangible weight that had been lifted from our chests, allowing us to breathe for the first time in years. The trials had been a spectacle, a grotesque circus that dominated the news cycle for 18 months, but unlike the gala where we had been the intruders, this time we watched from the gallery as the Vanduyn dynasty was dismantled piece by the very system they thought they owned. Silas's paper trail had been the structural weakness that brought the whole building down, a labyrinth of shell companies and illegal wire transfers that proved Alistair Vanduyn had been laundering money and silencing victims for decades, but it was Leo's video that sealed their fate, playing on loop for a jury that recoiled in horror at the sight of a father and son laughing while a pregnant woman drowned. Preston Vanduyn, the boy who thought he was a king, was currently serving a 25-year sentence in a medium-security federal facility in Pennsylvania, stripped of his trust fund, his reputation, and the arrogance that had been his armor, crying when the verdict was read like the child he effectively was. His father, the senator, had fared worse. The resurrection of the Aspen homicide case, combined with the racketeering charges in New York, had earned him life without the possibility of parole, a sentence he was serving in a medical ward as his health rapidly declined, a fitting end for a man who had spent his life consuming the vitality of others to sustain his own legacy. Silas stirred in the wicker chair next to me, adjusting his sunglasses and taking a sip of his iced tea, his presence a permanent fixture in our lives now that he had decided the Adirondacks were too quiet and that his brother needed keeping an eye on. He hadn't said it explicitly, but I knew he stayed because the war had changed him too, reminding him that chasing money and burying bodies was a hollow existence compared to sitting on a porch with family. "You know, Elias," he said, his voice rasping with the remnants of a nap, breaking the comfortable silence we had settled into. "I was reading the Times this morning. They're selling the Vanduyn estate in East Hampton. The bank foreclosed on it to pay the legal fees and the restitution to the victims' families." He looked at me with that familiar, knowing glint in his eye, the look of a man who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because he helped dig the graves. "They're tearing it down. A developer bought the land. Gonna subdivide the lot and build condos. Seems fitting, don't you think? The great American legacy turned into drywall and parking spaces." I chuckled, a low rumble in my chest that felt foreign after so much anger, and looked back through the window at Sophie, who was now placing trays into the oven, her face glowing with the heat of the kitchen and the pride of ownership. "It's just a building, Silas," I said, leaning back and closing my eyes against the setting sun, feeling the warmth on my face. "Just wood and stone and ego. It was never strong enough to hold them anyway. We built something better here." The monsters were gone, locked in cages of their own making, and the money they had worshipped had been scattered to the wind, used to rebuild the lives of the people they had broken. Sophie had used her portion to open the Safe Harbor Bakery, a place that employed women fleeing domestic violence, turning her pain into a ladder for others to climb out of the dark. I watched her wipe her hands on her apron and laugh at something a customer said, a genuine, bell-like sound that I hadn't heard since she was a child, and I felt a surge of pride so intense it made my throat tight because I knew that the strongest structures aren't the ones made of steel and concrete, but the ones that can withstand the storm and remain standing when the waters recede. The Vanduys had made a fatal calculation that night on the yacht. They looked at a retired ironworker and saw a man who was obsolete, a man who built things for them to own, forgetting that men who build skyscrapers know exactly where to place the charges to bring them down. They thought their money was a shield, but they forgot that money is just paper, and paper burns. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. I listened to the silence of the evening, and for the first time in 2 years, it didn't sound like the roaring of the ocean or the screaming of a drowning girl. It sounded like peace. I looked over at my brother, the man who had come down from the mountain to save us, and nodded. "We did good, Silas," I said softly. "We did good." He tipped his glass to me, the ice clinking softly. "We did necessary, Elias. Now, ask your daughter if those cinnamon rolls are ready." "I'm starving,"